Hey guys, this is Melissa with Love Covered Life, and this is going to be my second video in my series on the Atonement. So originally I was doing a series entitled What Did Jesus Really Teach? In this mini-series on atonement theories, which is probably going to be 3 videos long, we are looking at atonement theories that have historically been believed by the church, and then what we're going to do is pull all of that back to the Gospels and reconcile it with Jesus' message, his ministry, his teachings, and what he did say about his death. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't. Don't forget to talk to me in the comments. I love hearing from you guys. So in our last video on the atonement, we looked at 4 of the major atonement theories that have been historically believed by the church. I will link that below, but just briefly, we looked at the Ransom Theory, which states that Jesus offered his life to the devil as a ransom to buy back humanity who had sold themselves over to the devil in the Garden of Eden. We looked at the Satisfaction Theory, which states that our sin is an offense to God's honor, and Jesus died as satisfaction to restore God's honor. We looked at the Penal Substitutionary Atonement Theory, which states that our sin is a violation of God's justice, that God must punish sin, and so Jesus took the punishment that our sin deserved. And then we looked at the Christus Victor Theory, which states that Jesus in his incarnation, ministry, teachings, life, death, and resurrection entered into our human experience and united us with the divine, and in entering death and then rising from the dead, defeated our bondage to death. I stated in last week's video that I feel the Christus Victor theory is best representative of the character of God revealed to us in Jesus Christ. This week I want to go into a little more depth on the Christus Victor atonement theory, and I also want to look at 2 more atonement theories. The first one is the moral influence atonement theory, and the second is the scapegoat atonement theory. Now these have not been as widely taught and believed by the church as a whole, but I think that they have a lot to add. So first, the Christus Victor atonement theory. The Christus Victor theory focuses on Jesus Christ as the victor over all the powers of darkness, the devil, sin, the flesh nature, death, although a lot less emphasis is put on the devil than is in the Ransom Theory. The Christus Victor theory argues that the entire biblical text, the focus has been on God as victor over his enemies. So in the Old Testament, God was viewed as having victory over the enemies of Israel. In the New Testament, Jesus speaks of his death as judging or casting out the ruler of this world. So in John 14:30, speaking of his death, he says, "I don't have much more time to talk to you because the ruler of this world approaches. He has no power over me, but I will do what the Father requires of me so that the world will know that I love the Father." So the word here used for ruler is archon, which literally means ruler. So some people will take this reference to mean the spiritual rulers of the world, Satan or demonic powers, while others will take it to just mean the evil systems of corruption that are oppressing people. John 12:31 and 32, he says, "The time for judging this world has come, when Satan, the ruler of this world, will be cast out. And when I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw everyone to myself." So again, the Greek doesn't actually use the word Satan. That was added in by translators. Again, it just says the ruler of this world, which is the word archon. So in the previous video, I went through all the reasons why I feel that the Christus Victor theory best represents God's character of the 4 major atonement theories that have been taught by the church. The biggest problem that I had initially when studying the Christus Victor theory is that it's based around the idea of warfare and struggle between God and evil forces. And while that is something that we can deeply relate to here, because here we do experience that struggle. We do experience good and evil, light and dark, God and Satan. We experience that the dualism between those two things here. In reality, God is all that exists. Light is all that exists. Good is all that exists. Science, for instance, tells us that darkness is not actually a thing that exists. Okay? Light exists. Darkness is simply what happens in the absence of light. Also, cold is not a real thing that exists. Heat exists. Cold is simply what happens when heat is absent. We can see this demonstrated very clearly by the fact that all you have to do to get rid of darkness is to flip the switch and turn on the light. Darkness cannot eliminate light. That's just not how it works, because darkness has no power. It's not a real thing. It's just what happens when the light is absent. And all you have to do to get rid of darkness is to fill it with light. So in the same way, evil, bad, wrong, those things do not actually exist. The only place that they exist is in our perception, because they are the lack of awareness of the true reality, which is light and good and love. I realize how insensitive what I am saying can sound to people who are experiencing real suffering, and because of that, you're never going to find me saying this to a person one-on-one. But speaking generally and speaking of the big picture, this is the truth of what I have been shown. My near-death-like experience when I was 19, I was shown a vision of the world, and it was brilliant light, and I was shown that all the bad things that we experience here are illusions, and it's like flying up on a stormy day above the storm clouds, and then once you get up there, you look down and you see that the clouds don't actually exist. You just thought that they did. But in reality, everything is brilliant light, and we are all securely held in the hands of God. And I cannot fully explain how this works. I just know it to be the truth. And because of my own personal revelations on this, I don't feel that a theory of the atonement that portrays a cosmic battle between good and evil, God and the powers of darkness, is showing us the full truth of what happened. I'm not denying that it can be helpful and useful and comforting to us while we are here, because our experience here is of duality. But I think there's a deeper truth here. So I was wrestling with these ideas and thinking, how else could we explain this without the dualistic way of looking at it and still have Christ being the victor? And then it hit me. Look at the way that Jesus defeated the powers of darkness. His entire life, ministry, teachings are a peaceful, life-giving, and loving confrontation and conquest of the powers of darkness. He healed people. He fed people. He taught people. When Peter pulled out his sword and chopped off the ear of one of the men who was there to help arrest him, he healed the man. That was his response. His response was to heal. His response was to love. His response was forgiveness, right up until the very end. And in this, we see the truth of the reality of the way that the universe works. Love covers a multitude of sin. And that's what he was doing. He was covering the evil. He was covering the sin. He was covering the judgment. He was covering the darkness. He was covering all of it with love. And that's how he defeated it. Because love is the only thing powerful enough to defeat darkness. Because darkness is an illusion that needs to be filled with the light. So the way that you defeat darkness is you turn on the light. The way that you defeat evil is you love it out of existence. And this leads us to our next atonement theory, which is the moral influence atonement theory. The moral influence theory was taught by Abelard, and he was a contemporary of Anselm, who lived from 1072 to 1142. So in the previous video, we discussed Anselm's satisfaction theory, which proposed that Jesus was offering his life as payment to God. And Abelard was reacting against this idea as well as against the ransom theory. Abelard proposed instead that Jesus wasn't offering his life as a sacrifice to God or the devil. Instead, what he was doing was expressing the full character of divine love. In his life ministry teachings, death and resurrection, he perfectly and completely displayed the divine nature of love, and that display in and of itself was enough, because the people would see divine love displayed, their hearts would be softened, they would repent and be motivated to follow his example. Probably the strongest criticism of this atonement theory is that it doesn't go far enough. If the whole point of the cross was to set a moral example, then why couldn't Jesus just live a good life? What sets Jesus apart from any other moral teacher? What sets Jesus apart from any other martyr who's died for their faith? These are valid questions. The obvious answer is that any display of love is a display of God and has power to change people's hearts and lives. The thing that sets Jesus Christ apart is that he is the perfect revelation of God, and so he displayed God's love perfectly. Generally speaking, I don't think most of us understand the power of love displayed and demonstrated, because we don't understand that God is love and that anyone who loves knows God. So any display of love is a display of God, and it is the most powerful motivator for change that there is. The greatest commandment is to love. The only commandment is to love. There's a reason for that. Jesus' parables show us that the kingdom of heaven will spread on earth through us producing fruit, which means our demonstrations of love, our demonstrations of the character of God are enough to change the world. So why wouldn't the perfect demonstration of God's character by the perfect representation of God's nature be enough to save the world? Jesus said that he came to show us what the Father is like. And that demonstration of what the Father is like is what we see displayed in its fullness on the cross. Love covers a multitude of sin. Our small actions of love are powerful enough to cause a ripple effect that change things. Why wouldn't a God-sized demonstration of love be enough to change the entire world, to save the entire world? Why wouldn't a God-sized demonstration of love be enough to cover the sin of the world, to eliminate its effects and its hold and its bondage on us? Why wouldn't the love itself be enough? The next theory of the atonement that I want to look at is the scapegoat theory, and actually this is one of the more interesting theories. It's also the most recent theory that I'm aware of. It was developed by Rene Girard, who wrote his books in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So the scapegoat atonement theory is rooted into the psychology of how people deal with emotions like desire, greed, guilt, conflict. And actually there's a whole foundation of human psychology and behavior that builds up to his atonement theory, which I'm not going to be able to get into all of that in this video. It's rather complicated, and I will link an article in the description below that does a good job of explaining all this. Briefly, the idea is that humans, when in conflict, have a natural tendency to put their guilt onto a scapegoat, to find somebody to blame so that then they can come together united against this common enemy. Blaming and ultimately sacrificing a scapegoat, what it does is it brings about a temporary peace in the community. And this peace is temporary because the process of scapegoating is perceived as being successful as solving the problems and bringing people together. So it will be repeated again and again every time there's a conflict. So the word scapegoat actually comes from ancient Jewish tradition, where on the Day of the Atonement there would be two goats, and one of them would be sacrificed, and then the other one would have all the guilt of the community placed on it, and it would be led outside the city and left in the wilderness. And the idea was that a scapegoat was taking the guilt away from the people so that they would not have to carry it. Many ancient religious traditions would actually sacrifice humans as scapegoats. The community would pick an innocent victim to bear their blame for their forgiveness, protection, favor, whatever the case may be. The scapegoat mechanism is not just limited to ancient culture. It is at the heart of most politics and war and religion. We could go through example after example here of how this is playing out even in modern culture. Or to bring it closer to home, how about that person in the office who everybody hates and gossips about, and everybody feels better because they've gossiped about this other person? Or how about in family feuds when everybody gangs up on the daughter-in-law who doesn't do things the same way the family does, or the mother-in-law who's causing all the problems? How about in families where abuse happens? The children who are being abused will take out their anger and hurt on one child who is perceived to be the cause of all of their troubles. So in all of these cases, people are not physically killed or sacrificed, but it's the idea of blaming an innocent victim to bring everybody else together into a sense of community. What Rene Girard actually argues is that the entire purpose of the biblical text is to expose scapegoating as a way of interacting in community. And again, I'll link an article below because it goes into a lot of detail, but just quickly to sum it up, the sacrificial system was an example of God trying to discourage the Israelites from scapegoating each other. Now, this was not successful because the Israelites ended up sacrificing their children in religious rituals to Moloch, so God sends the prophets, who are a lot more direct in telling them that he never wanted sacrifice to begin with. And then when the messages of the prophets fail, God sends his son to expose the scapegoating mechanism for what it is. Jesus clearly talks about this in the parable of the vineyard and the workers in Matthew 21:33-46. Now listen to another story. A certain landowner planted a vineyard, built a wall around it, dug a pit for pressing out the grape juice, and built a lookout tower. Then he leased the vineyard to tenant farmers and moved to another country. At the time of the grape harvest, he sent his servants to collect his share of the crop. But the farmers grabbed his servants, beat one, killed one, and stoned another. So the landowner sent a larger group of his servants to collect for him, but the results were the same. Finally, the owner sent his son, thinking, surely they will respect my son. Which, right there, cancels any idea that we've had that God actually wanted the murder of his son. But when the tenant farmers saw his son coming, they said to one another, here comes the heir to this estate. Come on, let's kill him and get the estate for ourselves. So they grabbed him, dragged him out of the vineyard, and murdered him. Jumping to verse 46, when the leading priests and Pharisees heard this parable, they realized he was telling the story against them. They were the wicked farmers. So what Jesus is saying is that the Jews did not listen to the prophets. They killed all the prophets who had been sent to them. That violence and scapegoating has been the norm for all of human history, and now Jesus is predicting that he will do the same thing again, and they will kill the Son of God. It's interesting that in John 8:44, Jesus accuses the religious leaders of being children of the devil, and the reason why is because the devil was a murderer from the beginning. Their long history of murder and violence is Jesus' biggest charge against them, and we see this again in Matthew 23:34-37. Therefore I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers of religious law, but you will kill some by crucifixion, and you will flog others with whips in your synagogues, chasing them from city to city, As a result, you will be held responsible for the murder of all godly people of all time, from the murder of righteous Abel to the murder of Zacharias, son of Berechiah, whom you killed in the temple between the sanctuary and the altar. I tell you the truth, this judgment will fall on this very generation. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones God's messengers, how often I have wanted to gather your children together as a hen protects her chicks beneath her wings, but you wouldn't let me. What Jesus exposes here is that violence is the ultimate sin. And remember in Matthew chapter 5 that Jesus says anybody who is angry at his brother in his heart is as guilty as if he had murdered his brother. Violence is the ultimate sin because violence is harming your neighbor. So any sin is the opposite of loving your neighbor, believing that you are separate from your neighbor and from God, and that you are justified in judging or hurting your neighbor, that you can harm your neighbor without harming yourself or harming God, if we want to use that language, because really we can't harm God, but you get what I'm saying here. He talked of his death on the cross as if it would bring judgment on his generation and on the rulers of the world system, because killing the Son of God would be the culmination of the sin of the world. It would be the ultimate sin. Pulling all this back to the scapegoat theory, after everything else has failed, after the sacrificial system failed, after all the prophets were murdered, God's perfect revelation comes. And what happens is that the perfect expression and revelation of God himself takes on the role of the scapegoat to wake us up to the fact that God is not the one requiring a sacrifice. God is the one being sacrificed. God is in Christ, and Christ is in us, and we are in Christ, and Christ is in God. God is in every single one of us. And when we harm our neighbor, God is in our neighbor. We are harming God. According to the scapegoat theory, God stands on the side of the victim and shows that the victim has always been innocent and the community guilty. And by raising Jesus from the dead, God vindicates and proves his innocence and disrupts the temporary peace that usually follows a scapegoat sacrifice and welcomes us into an eternal peace and a new way of relating with each other and with him. I actually love this theory of the atonement because it helps to reconcile some of Paul's teachings on substitution and Jesus being a mercy seat in ways that are far more congruent with God's character than the penal substitutionary atonement theory. Jesus was our substitute, not because God needed someone to punish, but because we needed someone to punish. Jesus took our sin, not because God demanded it, but because we put our sin on him. We were the ones punishing. We have always been the ones punishing. We have always been the ones demanding a sacrifice. I'm going to stop here today, but be on the lookout for my next video. We're really going to dive into some of the historical context surrounding what led up to Jesus' crucifixion, and then we're going to take all 6 of these atonement theories and pull them together to just really create a mind-blowingly beautiful picture of what happened on the cross. All right, don't forget to comment and let me know what you think. Be loved, be happy, be at peace, and thank you for watching.